Hello, we're Group 1. My name is Arbor, and our other members are Samantha, Dominic, Faria, Bilal, and Maharshi. Today, we will be reviewing the emergency department triage process. To provide some background, St. Joseph's has a very busy ED with over 100,000 patient visits per year, and the majority of those patients are ambulatory when they present, which means they require initial assessment by a nurse at triage. The objective of our project was to process, map, and then focus on one key task to perform an in-depth assessment utilizing the NASA TLX and REBA tools and provide an alternative solution which was reduce stress and strain on the task performer. I will now pass it on to Dominic, who will review our process maps.
Thanks, Arbor. So I'll walk through the steps of the overall triage process in our process map from the point the patient enters the ED to when they arrive at another ED area. So first, the patient walks into the department through the emergency department entrance. The patient is immediately then met by a greeter who directs them to the welcome booth and waiting area. The patient then takes a number from the welcome booth and sits in the general waiting area. The patient is then called by the triage nurse, and they go up to the main triage desk. The triage nurse takes general information up from the patient, including their chief complaint, does a critical look, and completes an FRI screen. The triage nurse then completes their full assessment of the patient, which involves taking the vital signs and assigning the CTAS score. And this is the task that we'll be exploring in a bit more detail later. At a key decision point here, if the patient is stable, they are directed to sit in the waiting room and wait for registration to call their name. Registration will then call the patient to come to the registration desk, and then full registration is completed, where their health card is collected, there's confirmation of address, their emergency contact, and their armband is applied. Then registration instructs the patient to sit down in the waiting room again, and they wait to be called. The patient is then sent with their chart over to the emerge ambulatory area and arrives in that area of the ED. Going back to that key decision point previously, if the patient is not stable, and an ECG or blood work is required, the patient is brought by the triage nurse to a separate assessment area. The triage nurse completes the ECG or blood work and then sends the patient directly to a bed in the ED acute area accompanied by a nurse. Registration is then notified to complete registration at the bedside, and the patient arrives in that other area of the department. So going to the next slide. So this just gives a bit of an overview of the triage nurse assessment and some of the details that take place during that assessment. Next slide. The swim lane diagram shows the steps in the triage process again from patient entry in the ED to arrival to another ED area, but it outlines which steps in the process are performed by the key players. The key players here include the patient, the greeter, the triage nurse, and registration. So now I'll pass it on to Maharshi to look at some observations regarding that specific triage task that we highlighted in red.
Thank you, Dom. So I'll be talking about the current triage workstation setup, the procedure, and our observations. So on this slide, you'll see this is a typical setup for the triage workstation there, where the nurse will be taking all the general info for the patients and the vitals. On the next slide, once the patient stabilization is confirmed, they go back to the waiting area and they call back onto registration desk, which looks very similar to nurse's station. On slide 4, as you can see, this is the current workflow. The patients are set across the nurse's station and the vital machines are also physically separated. This design forces nurses to leave their workspace just to complete the basic step in the triage process. And you also notice there's no clear flow between these areas. So the patients may be seated far from the station and the nurse has to step away repeatedly if needed. This layout not only increases the physical strain, but also introduces a safety risk and reduce patients' throughput, because now the procedure is taking way longer for the nurses to get up, out, and come back again. The registration desk will call the patients to complete the full registration after the assessment is completed. And on to the next slide. Based on this entire process, the team decided to choose on taking the vitals as the main focus. It is one of the most repetitive and moment-heavy and ergonomically challenging step. It's also that it's a clear candidate to improve without requiring the major infrastructure change. We saw that this task contributes the most of the delays and the nurses' fatigue. And by targeting this area, we believe we could have the greatest impact with the minimal disruption. On the next slide. In this slide, we break down the specific issues a nurse faces during the vital collections. The nurse is often seated away from the patient, making it hard to observe their condition clearly. The poor line of sight and audio lead to ineffective assessments. And to collect the vitals, the nurse gets up, walks out, bends over the machine, and returns to the computer. This task is both time consuming and physical demanding, and particularly during the long or busy shift. Because the vital signs machines are also shared between two stations, there's often a weight involved, and adding even more pressure and inefficiency. And I'll pass it to Faria now.
Thank you, Marcy. So in this section, we will walk through the assessment of triage nurses' tasks, which is processing of collecting vital signs. We use two tools, VIBA to assess physical and ergonomic strain, and NASA TLX assessment to capture mental and emotional workload. Now let's take a look at the finding. Next slide, please. When we assess the physical side of the task using VIBA tool, the score came out to 11, which is actually the very high risk category. That means that the way the task is being done right now really needs to be changed. Now, what caused the high score? Mostly things like awkward neck and back posture, arms being raised too high, and wrists not lined up properly were the contributing factor. Also, the nurses were holding static position for over a minute at a time while taking vital signs, which adds a lot of strain to the body. Next slide. We use the NASA TLX tool to evaluate the mental and emotional workload. Across all participants, frustration and temporal demand were consistently high. That suggests that the nurses felt rushed and emotionally strained while taking vital signs. We also saw a lot of variability in mental, physical, and effort score, which could reflect differences in working experience or working styles. Despite these challenges, performance scores still remain high, meaning that the nurses felt that they were still able to complete the task, but it came at a cost. Next slide. Here we have a bar chart that shows average NASA TLX scores across all 6 dimensions. Frustration and temporal demand were the highest, which tells us that the nurses felt rushed and emotionally strained. Interestingly, performance was still high, meaning that they were getting the job done, but likely at a cost. Effort and physical demand were moderately high, reflecting that the physical activity of moving around the desk was involved. Mental demand was the lowest, likely because the task is familiar and routine for most staff. Next slide. Now, this slide summarizes the key issues we identified in the current triage process. Starting with the workflow inefficiencies, nurses have to leave their workstation to collect vital signs, which results in motion and waiting waste. The delays are worse during peak hours when extra staff are added just to manage vitals, representing both overprocessing and skills waste. On the safety and ergonomic side, there is no barrier between the nurse and the patient, which raises safety concerns. Staff also face a risk of repetitive strain injury due to awkward posture and prolonged static work. Both of these contributes to emotional fatigue. Lastly, the layout and design of the triage station was a major contributor. Poor ergonomics and lack of physical separation increases stress, while the setup disrupts pacing and adds frustration. Altogether, these issues point to a system that is physically and mentally taxing and in need of redesign. Now I will hand it off to Samantha to discuss process improvement.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's have a look at the image of our future state in our triage workstation. We can move over to the next slide. Thank you. So as you can see by the image, the layout now places all vital equipment, which includes blood pressure cuff and temperature equipment, within arm's reach of the triage chair. And the nurse and patients are seated in front of one another. And the equipment is also color-coded to enable for faster identification. So if we go to the next slide, we can have a closer look at the overall layout. And what we're seeing here is a diagram that illustrates the proposed future state layout of the triage area. So as I mentioned, each triage nurse is now stationed directly across from the patient, and the vital machines are placed within arm's reach in every triage bay. And as shown by the lack of little red dash nursing walking pad, this setup significantly reduces the unnecessary movement. And also the registration clerks are located in a separate area, keeping the triage process streamlined and focused on patient assessment. So if we move on to the next slide, the key benefits of this redesign are really centered on impact. So it eliminates motion waste and also leads to significant improved ergonomics. And REBA scores drop due to better posture, reduced twisting, and less reaching. With fewer environmental distractions, nurses can concentrate more fully on the assessment, which supports both accuracy and patient rapport. And there's clearer communication due to the face-to-face seating and reduced noise. Now, finally, if we go to the next slide, the impact of these tasks redesign is clear. Assessments are now faster and more consistent, which improves overall flow in triage. Nurses report significantly lower frustration and effort, as shown in reduced NASA TLX scores. And most importantly, the work environment is safer, less physically and mentally taxing, helping to prevent burnout and improve quality care. So I'll pass it over to Bilal to have a deeper look.
Thank you, Sam. I'll be walking us through the final section of this presentation, where we take a step back and evaluate how effective the new workplace improvements would be, specifically for the tasks for taking the vitals by the nurses. As a quick recap, we originally identified 4 major pain points associated with this task. 1, excessive walking. 2, poor visibility and audibility. 3, safety concerns. 4, high workload. So when we designed the new workplace layout, these 4 major points were the primary drivers to make sure we can improve on those. Next slide. The feedback from the proposed design was encouraging by the nurses, particularly regarding the reduced walking, which would save them a lot of time and energy. And another major win was the sense of improved safety. Nurses mentioned that they would feel more secure with having a physical barrier between themselves and the patients, which would reduce emotional stress tied to this task. Next slide. We also wanted to quantify these expected improvements, so we turned to NASA TLX assessment. And we deemed that the frustration associated with the task dropped by 64%. The effort required to perform the task would drop by 34%. The physical demand would fall by approximately 39%. The temporal demand would drop by 22%. And it would result in an overall expected performance being improved by 8%. Each of these data points would confirm that the new setup would directly address the challenges we set out to solve. Next slide. Finally, we reassessed this task using REBA, and the score was 3, which classifies as a very low risk and no immediate action required for this task, which is significantly better than the pre-design of this task. The key factors contributing to the low REBA score would be minimize repetitive movements, whereby the nurses no longer have to walk physically to the vital station or to address patients, and improve posture while collecting vitals. So the nurses are no longer in an awkward or physically taxing positions when taking vitals. While these results would be promising, we would recommend that a periodic reassessment would be necessary to ensure that this score remains at 3 or can be improved upon. I'd now like to give the floor back to Arbor to conclude our presentation.
Thank you, Bilal. So to summarize our results and our assessments, the current process in place at St. Joseph Healthcare includes many wasteful non-value-added steps, which are frustrating for nurses and patients. And the current process contained many ergonomic challenges. Our proposed solution alleviates those challenges and reduce the REBA score from 11 to 3, improving the process by a factor of 8. And there was significant improvements in the NASA TLX assessment, reducing effort, frustration, and physical demands. Overall, overall, our solution will result in increased efficiencies, improved safety and ergonomics, and enhanced communication. That's the end of our presentation. We hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for listening.